On May 25th, 1961, President John F. Kennedy, in an address to the U.S. Congress, issued a challenge to the entire country when he said, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. This July will mark the 53rd anniversary of the day America met that challenge, just 8 years after the president threw down the gauntlet. But this monumental feat could not have been accomplished without using data that was made actionable. There were innumerable logistical issues to tackle. You can see some of those obstacles listed on the screen, and the list could go on and on. Just remember that the microprocessor would not even be invented until 1971. So the technology needed to conquer all these insurmountable obstacles simply did not exist. I mean, it's not like they could Google anything because the internet hadn't been invented yet either. They just had to make it up as they went. All of this exponentially increased the value of having actionable data during the Apollo program to give NASA the insight they needed to answer the incessant questions, make those tough decisions, and ultimately meet JFK's challenge. Techopedia defines actionable insight as information that can be acted upon or information that gives enough insight into the future that the actions that should be taken become clear for decision makers. In other words, meaningful data that's useful for making a decision, answering a question, or solving a problem. It distinguishes data that can improve things from data that serves as nothing more than fancy window dressing or interesting trivia. But in data storytelling, with every data visualization, you have to start somewhere. You have a concept or an idea in mind, and then you have as your end goal a completed visualization containing one or more graphs. Now, how do you get from concept to reality? I'd like to think of this user experience journey as a spectrum, along which I suggest various stages, specifically 5, for best practices in getting from the idea on the left to the completed visualization on the right. These 5 stages are conception, inception, perception, inspection, and direction. Now, the way I've listed these stages from left to right across the screen here, you might assume that I intend for them to occur one after the other. Maybe so, but they can also be concurrent and even overlapping. In any case, we need to look at these in the light of a strategy that's comprehensive and with a positive mindset. You see, this is supposed to be an enjoyable thing to do, not a drudgery. And don't forget, before your concept becomes reality, it needs to be visualized and it must stand up to scrutiny. I'll give you more detail on that in just a few moments. All right, let's jump right in. First stage is conception. Hey, you have to start the race somewhere. Now, how do we go about doing that? Well, I see the key word here as articulate. And as you articulate the need, it's important to understand your audience. You know, those are the people who are going to be consuming your data. Look, you wouldn't articulate the need to a room full of project managers in the same way you would to a group of business intelligence specialists or to DBAs and programmers in the same way that you would to, say, a bunch of university faculty members or anyone else. You must also know your data. Now, that's a given because you need to be able to articulate what you want to do with the data. And doing so is where your concept or your idea is conceived. Now, the most important thing to be articulated is the purpose for your data. That is, what are you trying to show? Are you showing comparison, distribution, composition, or relationship? Well, the answer to that is going to determine the type of visualization that will be the most important and appropriate for the story you're telling with your data. And that in turn will lead to even more questions that guide you to refine your approach along the way. Think of it as a hierarchy. Dr. Andrew Abella, chairman of the Department of Business and Economics at the Catholic University of America, has come up with an amazing graphics tool that I believe masterfully articulates the need and sets the pace with these 4 categories that he has identified for data storytelling. All right, here's a closer look at a Bellows chart chooser cheat sheet. You see the 4 categories radiating out from the centers, the questions coming off of that, and the sub-questions, and the right graph type at the very end. All right, let's take composition as the example. Start asking questions. Does it change over time or is it static over time? And if it changes over time, well, are you talking about many time periods or few time periods? And if there are many periods, well, then are the differences relative or are they relative and absolute? So you see how certain questions lead to other questions as you proceed along the decision tree here. And that helps you, again, to refine your approach and come up with the right graph. No, at least the ones that are considered to be the best practice. All right, that's the stage of conception. Second stage is inception. Once the race has been started, here's where we need to make the case. Keyword is advocate. Make the case for expressing the concept visually. Folks, this is very powerful for a couple of reasons, according to Mike Parkinson, founder of Billion Dollar Graphics. He says we're affected in 2 ways, cognitively and emotionally. First of all, cognitively. Graphics speed up the way we communicate and help us to better understand and more clearly remember what we've learned. They're like visual clues that we can use to unlock a deeper meaning and focus our attention, so it's more likely we'll remember what we've seen. Secondly, we're affected emotionally. Graphics also improve our mindset and affect our feelings. They connect with our creativity by stimulating different parts of the brain, leading us to more fully understand what's being presented. Now, do you realize what Parkinson's saying here? We are affected both cognitively and emotionally. In other words, graphics get a hold of both our brains and our hearts. Hey, what better marriage could you possibly want? I mean, anytime that you're able to touch both the brain and the heart, man, oh man, you have got something good going. Hey, that's both beauty and brains at work. British data journalist David McCandless said in the 2010 TED Talk that sight, by far, has the highest bandwidth of any of the 5 senses. About 80% of the information we take in is by eye, he said. Additional research since then shows that to be more like 90%. A couple of European research professors, Emery Sawyer and Robin Hogarth, teamed up on a study in which 3 groups of economists were asked the same question regarding a particular data set. Now, the results of this study seem to support McCandless's TED Talk claim. One group was given the data and a standard statistical analysis of the data. Remember, they only had one job to do here, right? Just one question. 72% of those economists could not get the answer right. A second group was given the data, the statistical analysis, and a graph. Now, if you guess that the second group did better than the first group, then you'd be right. But not by much. Still, 61% of those economists couldn't pull it off. Again, they only had one question to answer. A third group was given only the graph, no data, no analysis, nothing, just the graph, and only 3% of them got the answer wrong. You know what? This certainly makes the case for visual representation of data, and it's certainly something that we can advocate. That's the stage of inception. All right, the third stage is perception. So far, you've learned to start the race and you've made your case. Now, motivate the base. Keyword here is educate. Hey, folks, we're not going to get very far in this data storytelling process if either the target audience or the stakeholders are not on board. So we need to educate them, making them realize that they've got some skin in this game. I mean, they can't take ownership or provide the necessary backing financially or otherwise if they don't understand what you're trying to present, or if they can't see what's in it for them, or if the visualization does not help them to make a decision, answer a question, or solve a problem. Now, how do I go about doing this? By understanding some basic principles. Hey, folks, that's foundational to any educational initiative. So it begs the question, does form follow function? I'd have to say yes. You know, it's the age-old argument, right? Is it pretty or is it right? Does it look good or does it work? All right, with this business of form following function leads to another question. What do we mean by form and function? Okay, function's what you do with the data. That's the brains. Whereas form is how to express functional outcomes in the best possible way. That's the beauty. All right, here's some best practices or cardinal rules that we need to keep in mind to assure that function gets the right priority over form in our data storytelling. Yeah, it'll look pretty, but it's more important that it be right. Let me show you some examples of what not to do and how to deal with it. First of all, pie charts. Oh boy, you gotta love them or hate them, you know? There's typically no middle ground with these guys. Some people think they're the best thing since sliced bread, while others say they're the spawn of the devil himself. But regardless of how you might feel about pie charts, it should be pretty easy to understand that pie charts are supposed to show the parts of a whole. Everybody ought to know that, you'd think, but some people just don't get it. I'll show you what I mean. Take a look at the pie chart shown in this fuzzy screenshot from a TV newscast. I see a couple of problems with this chart right off the bat. I mean, first of all, look at the numbers. If you add them up, you get 193. How can you have 193% of a single pie? That's almost like two pies, isn't it? Right? Secondly, check out the sizes of each slice. Okay. All right. 70 is supposed to be bigger than 60, isn't it? Yeah. Well, then how come that 60 slice looks bigger than the 70 slice, huh? In reality, the survey questions used in putting this news report together allowed for multiple choices. That is, respondents were able to indicate support for more than one candidate. Aha, light bulb moment. Now you see why the numbers add up to more than 100. Now, that in and of itself isn't necessarily a problem. The problem here is that's not the way we show things in a pie chart. We can therefore pretty safely conclude that this pie chart is misleading. And in this particular case, well, a bar graph would have reflected the data much more accurately, don't you think? Something like this. It's the same data, but presented in a way that is not misleading. So what about line graphs and bar charts? Okay, here's a screenshot from a South American newscast with a graph showing the number of COVID-19 tests performed per million among the populations of the 6 countries depicted. Now, upon first glance, it doesn't look too bad, but look more closely at the 3 bars in the middle. The 7,000 per million in the US is 21 times bigger than the 330 per million in Argentina, right? But the bar for the US is only slightly bigger than the one for Argentina. You see a similar distortion in the bar for Italy. 14,000 is twice as big as 7,000, isn't it? Yet once again, Italy's bar is only slightly taller than the one for the US. What's the point here? Well, to get an honest picture and make honest decisions, data must be presented honestly. No distortions. See, the distorted perception that this graph tries to portray, at least subconsciously anyway, is that the differences aren't all that great among these 6 countries when that is simply not true. All right, up to this point, you've started the race, you've made your case, and you've motivated the base. Now, number 4, give it some space. With this 4th stage of the spectrum, by asking the question, does it stand up to scrutiny? This is inspection, with the key word being investigate. Folks, being totally transparent helps you to avoid the pitfalls of bias and unethical use of your data when it's being inspected. And when you've done your due diligence, you are not going to cringe when you get these questions. You know the ones I'm talking about. Your favorite questions. Did you ensure data quality? Where did you get your data? How do you know it's right? You won't be bothered by them. They will not intimidate you. In a 2017 blog post, Matt Rainey, founder and director at a European talent search firm specializing in big data, advocated the importance of big data, transparency in big data, and suggested 3 aspects of transparency. First, it starts with a story. What better way can you make sense of an unintelligible mass of numbers than to put them into a story? Again, that's the whole point of a visualization, isn't it? We learn best by seeing things in stories. And as I said earlier in this presentation, understanding their data helps people take ownership and, by extension, facilitates their ability to explain it or justify it to whomever needs to know. Secondly, it involves showing the data for what it is: warts, wrinkles, blemishes, and all. No manipulations allowed. As I alluded to before, correct, honest decisions and correct conclusions can only come from correct, unadulterated, unmanipulated data. Lastly, Rainey says that transparency is all about trust. Hey, aren't you more inclined to believe what you can trust? I love the way Rainey put it. Look at this. When the business learns to trust the numbers, they have a solid foundation for making the best decisions and subsequent growth. So, having taken transparency into consideration, as you let the data behind your visualization project stand up to inspection, it's important to be aware of the difference between impact and influence and how that plays into making data actionable. All right, impact is typically recognized as the effect brought on by outside forces that tend to push on your status quo. By contrast, influence is known to be the power to affect from internal forces that tend to pull on your status quo. To put it bluntly, as I alluded to near the beginning of this presentation, your idea must be visualized, then scrutinized before it can be realized. In other words, if you've given it some space and it can stand up to inspection, you are well on your way to making your concept a reality with actionable data. Well, after having started the race, making the case, motivating the base, and giving it some space, we now come to the fifth and final stage of the spectrum: direction. It's time to put it into place. Keyword here is effectuate. Now, how do you put it into place? What's the direction here? I see this implementation cycle as a fourfold iterative process. You start off by deploying your solution using whatever organizational protocols and methodologies you already have in place. As your stakeholders start using the solution, they'll discover issues. You then analyze those issues and discern the right course of action to address them. Then you start developing the remediation for those issues. And guess what? The cycle starts all over again. Deploy, discover, discern, and develop. And hopefully, you'll improve upon your solution with each iterative cycle. Now, that, my friends, is an effective direction because it leads to progress. One last review in summary. Here are the 5 stages of the spectrum one last time. For the sake of time, I'll just list them here: conception, inception, perception, inspection, and direction. Enterprise account executive and expert data storyteller Spencer Sobczak once said, "Data storytelling is both an art and a science. Our data visualizations are the most powerful when they find this balance." Hey, you now have the tools. So let's go balance art and science. Let's combine form and function. Let's blend both beauty and brains. Folks, I am totally convinced that if you articulate, advocate, educate, and investigate your data, you should be able to effectuate a solution. Ladies and gentlemen, with actionable data, NASA exceeded President Kennedy's monumental challenge more than a half century ago, and not only sent astronauts to the moon successfully, but also returned them to the Earth safely. And what's more, they repeated this 5 more times over the next 3 years. They definitely knew how to balance art and science, beauty and brains. Remember, they couldn't have done it without actionable data. Data is actionable only when it helps people to make a decision, answer a question, or solve a problem. I leave you with this: with both beauty and brains, turn your ideas into reality by making data actionable. Thanks so much for your time.